All right, thank you to Simone and all the presenters, and it's an honour to be coming in after Peggy with such an inspiring program in the US. So essentially what I'll be talking about is an assessment of Australia's capacity to undertake ecological restoration. We know that there is a huge need for ecological restoration in this country. We have now the UN decade on ecological restoration. So how do we better understand what our capacity is? If we don't understand that, then we're really just sort of, staggering along in the dark. So really seed's the fundamental resource required for, seed-based restoration. And yet fundamentally the question about how seed can be sourced and whether it's effective, ethical, in a structured manner, all these things are actually often poorly understood and unresolved. And in essence, there's some of the questions we've tried to sort of address. So the Australian seed sector broadly consists of a wide range of players, and you can see there individuals, businesses, NGOs, unis, community, traditional owner groups, and governments at varying levels. But it's developed in an ad hoc rather than a structured fashion over many decades, and hence these groups do not always work together in the most effective or efficient way. And on top of that, we have the availability and the quality of native seed in Australia affected by continuing impacts, and in many cases increasing impacts of habitat clearing, fragmentation, weed competition, climate change. And all those things alter community structure and composition, and that has flow-on consequences for the native seed sector, and by virtue of that, restoration outcomes. So we undertook this national survey in the end of 2016 and into 2017. And essentially, it really tried to quantify our capacity to undertake ecological restoration or restoration in different forms as a nation. So really you can see there some of the things we were aiming to test. And what I'm going to give you now is an overview of what we found. So we asked all the respondents to our survey to self-isolate into one of 4 groups, even though we acknowledge that there is crossover between each group. So often, you do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. What we asked respondents to do is to say, well, where would you consider most of your focus to reside? And based on that, people sorted into 4 groups, and they were seed collectors, SPA growers, which are effectively people who manage seed production areas, or for our overseas and in particular American guests, seed increase or seed farming. Then we asked for a group of seed purchasers. So primarily you're trying to purchase seed for your own projects or distribution, and then other users. And other users could be people in community groups, university researchers, landholders. So what we found when we broke all that down, when we asked people to select a single category that best aligned with their main area of activity, most participants identified as seed collectors, 48%, and the remainder were almost equally distributed between purchasers, seed growers, and other users. Now, these findings surprisingly align with early sector surveys, and the main one we refer back to is the Flora Bank survey of about 1998, I think, but there were some smaller state-based surveys after that. These align with those surveys, indicating that most in our sector, in terms of people, are engaged with seed collection. And then they pass that on to a smaller number of people who increase, purchase, research, bank, whatever, that native seed for other purposes. And there you can see in terms of percentages, that's the breakdown. So we think that our sample, which is our national survey, represents a good snapshot of the broader sector, in that we are likely to have the bulk of the people operating in our sector working as seed collectors, and then under these smaller other subsections. In terms of the survey, and again, the broader sector, We found that most people were located in New South Wales and the ACT, Victoria, WA, South Australia, and then the smaller states and territories. So we had representation across all of Australia, but most respondents came from the larger states. And this seems to fit in with that notion again, that in terms of economics and land use and programs, a lot of the people, a lot of the programs are undertaken in some of those bigger states. So that might account for that location breakdown. We asked people as well to affiliate to a particular group. So we broke these groups down, and essentially just over half of the respondents were associated with either commercial organisations or government agencies. So essentially half of all our respondents were commercial operators, provider operators, or associated with government agencies. The remainder were private landholders, NGOs, and community groups, a smaller proportion. Now, this breakdown shows an increase or a higher percentage of commercial and private and government orientated representation than what had occurred in the earlier surveys, which were much more dominated by volunteer and community group involvement. So we seem to have had a shift in our sector to a higher representation of private operators. And here you can see a slide that sort of shows that. If you look at the different colours here, I'm just going to whisk through this. There will be an opportunity I'll talk about later to drill down into all this information, but you can see there seed collectors and seed growers are predominantly coming in under commercial organisations, seed purchasers, mainly in local or state government, and seed other in this other group, which we found out through a different set of questions were often associated with universities. So the workforce size, this is a really big question in relation to the capacity to undertake restoration. And of great concern was the finding that irrespective of the groups, the workforce size of most of the seed-related enterprises was really small. So collectively, just over 50% of the people who were in this survey indicated that they worked in organisations that employed less than 5 staff. And almost 1/3 of those were sole traders, and a large proportion of those sole traders employed part-time. So if you take that as a whole, this is a really concerning finding, and you could extrapolate that Australian seed markets do not yet support large enterprises and or the associated infrastructure and capacity required to undertake landscape scale restoration. And here again, it's just a slide showing that. And you see the largest group, the seed collectors, they're all sort of congregated in this section, the lower staffing section, the same for SPA growers. You find here with seed purchasers, which is the government sort of biased group, you get some of those appearing in these larger staffing ranges, and also the other group, which would be the universities. So we found out that these were associated with workplaces that had much larger staffing, and a small section of that was related to seed, so that accounts for that. We asked a whole bunch of questions that we thought were potential issues of concern for our sector, which would constrain its capacity. And we asked people to rank those from 0 to 5 in terms of importance. And here they are, and you can see here, and these are weighted averages. So every question that we asked ranked above 2.5. So there were no questions that we asked that people thought were of low importance. That's the first point to make. But you can see here that when we prioritised or ranked all of these questions, these were the sort of ones that ranked highly across all those groups. So future demand for seed will be difficult to meet from wild populations. The market is unwilling to pay for the true cost of seed. Going back to Simone's presentation, there's a lack of seed available from a broad range of species. Demand is inconsistent, orders are too short. So you can see here, these are questions that people perceive to be an issue. And when we break that down into the groups, you can see it's quite interesting. So for seed collectors, the market is unwilling to pay the true cost of seed. It's their most important issue. seed orders are made at short notice, and then future demand from wild populations will be difficult. Seed growers are saying to meet shortfalls, we need seed production. That's their biggest issue. Demand is inconsistent. And again, back to this future demand from wild harvest. Seed purchases, that's their main issue. Seed demand will be difficult to find. And seed collectors, other users are saying that there are a lack of suitable collectors. So I'm going to skim through now a whole bunch of issues which really talk to our capacity to undertake large-scale restoration. And the first cab off the rank is seed licensing. We found that from the seed collecting group, about 61% held current licenses, but 24 didn't, and the remainder were unsure whether they were even required. So comments though, we got over 400, 500 comments from people in addition to our questions. And these comments, many of them relating to seed licensees, were saying that there were difficulty with navigating licensing requirements. So this is to get permits to collect seed. And that included that the processes were sometimes complicated, they're arbitrary, there's difficulties in interpreting decision makers from regulators, long turnaround times between applying for and getting licenses. And so as a result, many collectors choose to actually work without permits. So our licensing system is unlikely to be working as it's intended. Equally worrying was that seed purchasers, the people who buy seed, largely dominated by government agencies, only half of respondents responded that they required collectors to hold a license. And almost another quarter were unsure if licenses were required. So these findings suggest there's a clear need for meaningful discussions between licensing agencies and practitioners to create a more effective and workable and equitable seed licensing system. Because if people can't collect seed in a transparent and effective manner that means that they can run a business and we can do restoration, then we're stumbling at the first hurdle. Seed origin. So there were some questions about seed provenance. We're asking about where are we getting our seed? You know, what are the implications? So collectors, where are you collecting seed? Growers, where are you collecting founding material? And purchasers, what proportion of your seed originates from the following tenures? What we found was that most seed in Australia is taken from private properties, public reserves and roadsides, and that the small amount is taken from state and national parks. So these findings may allay concerns from some people who say we want to protect from overharvest from state and national parks. But what they do is they verify that much of the seed used in restoration is sourced from what are likely to be fragmented and small populations with a high probability of inbreeding depression, and that increases the prospects our restorations are genetically unhealthy. This would also increase the stress on already impacted native populations, and it indicates again that there's a need for a discussion between practitioners and regulators on allowing well-supervised collections from the large and healthy populations that do reside on national and state parks, so that we can get a better genetic representation of seed for restoration. And here you can see the findings there are skewed towards private property, public reserves, and then so on. We wanted to find about collection and usage ranges. So where are we collecting seed? So back to that question about provenancing. And what we found was that in the late 1990s, provenancing for local provenance was what our early sector said that the sector wanted. We wanted local seed. What we found is that in recent times, there's been a shift towards a much broader notion of provenance. So this might have been prompted by revised guidance on collection ranges in the light of climate change predictions, but it also means that people are ignoring or flouting provenance range stipulations purely to meet pragmatic goals around demand and price and business viability. And I think these are incredibly interesting graphs. Remember that most of us is assuming the local provenance is less than 10 kilometres. If you just look at these trend lines, the blue is for seed collectors and the grey one underneath is for seed purchasers, where they would accept seed from. And this is just for trees. So you can see here that seed is being collected or accepted from ranges, category ranges, which are much skewed towards the more distant end. Exactly the same for shrubs, so very little around the 10 kilometres, but skewed towards and up to and including greater than 500. The same for grasses, the skewing is towards the more distant ranges, and exactly the same for wildflowers. So our survey has really revealed something interesting there. The plant types, what plant types are we using in our restorations? We broke plant types down into trees, shrubs, grasses and wildflowers. The findings revealed that other than for shrubs where supply actually exceeded demand, there was a little disparity between the amount of seed available at the moment on an annual basis and that demanded by purchasers. And at face value, that's good information that, you know, given that we're concerned about not being able to meet supply. We also found that trees and shrubs were the most sought after groups. And this bias towards the woody flora is a well-recognised syndrome in Australian restoration, and it's market-led in line with government funding for tree-focused programs and carbon offsets. And again, here you can see here, this is seed collectors, trees and shrubs, they're the main groups, and trees and shrubs are the main groups for seed buyers. So a really big question about our capacity then, if demand sort of equals supply, how much are we actually collecting and using? So we asked, what are you collecting on an annual basis and what are you purchasing on an annual basis? And our findings were extremely concerning. They showed across each of the 4 plant groups that seed is overwhelmingly collected and used annually in small volumes. So tellingly, almost 1/3 of suppliers and demanders sourced or used seed in minute annual quantities, so in the less than 5 kilogram category, whereas only a small proportion, 12 and 7% of suppliers and demanders sourced or used seed in these relatively larger categories of 100 up to 500 kilos quantities. So what this really has shown us, based on similar questions from earlier surveys, is that seed availability, the volumes we're producing, has essentially remained static for at least over the last decade and a half. And to us, the authors, this seems an indictment on the poor rate of sector development in those years, whether it's occurred because our landscapes continue to degrade, or, and probably more likely, the governments and the sector has failed to effectively assist in the development of suitable market structures, coordination and capacity. But what it really means is that when you extrapolate this, it indicates that the scale of restoration outcomes in Australia would be barely modest, and future scale, large scale species-rich ecosystem restoration of the type that we're envisaging in the UN decade are unlikely to occur on Australian soils. Now, to me, that's a shattering outcome. And here you can see the graphs. So look at the trends again. This is for trees. Again, these are the categories that we gave all the respondents, but look at the trends. Annually, the trend is pushed towards the low categories. The same for shrubs, low categories, grasses, and the wildflowers. So you can see here that some people are collecting in the large, but overall, people are taking in the small categories. So we're hardly collecting any species, any seed. What about species diversity? We question people on the level of diversity asked for in tenders or in restoration programs, and what plant groups did or didn't they use. And our findings were upsetting again. Almost 2/3 of seed collectors and half of purchasers nominated the less than 20 species category as the main number of species they use. And only small proportions nominated these higher species diversity categories. And 1/3 of respondents said that they didn't utilise at all one or more of the whole 4 defined plant groups. And when you consider that these plant groups are essentially surrogates for diversity and functional diversity, this is very concerning. And again, it indicates that most Australian restorations are unlikely to be species rich and would fall short, well short of any goals to mitigate the diversity currently being lost in this country. So SPARs, seed production, seed increase, can they help us? Most respondents nominating the seed as seed growers, operators, commercial growers, that's interesting. Most were either commercial, most were located in Victoria and New South Wales. But like the broader sector, they employed few staff, so they were very small. The findings showed also that they maintained only low levels of diversity. So with the largest group growing only less than 10 species, and only 3% of seed production growers had more than 100 species in their crops. So again, while many believe that seed production can provide reliability for seed quantity, quality, and diversity, at the moment they are not living up to promise. And without significant investment for SPA development, through things like infrastructure grants or targeted tax concessions, they are not going to help us meet our needs. So you can see here that just some graphs on seed production. Most of the production systems are based around field crops. Seed production size in Australia is very small. So most of them 0.2, 0.5, 1 to 5 hectares, 5 to 10. So most seed production in Australia is small. In the US, routinely you get seed increase farms up to hundreds to thousands of hectares. And as you can see, grasses are the dominant species in seed production at the moment. Seed testing, we really need to understand the quality of seed. Again, so many worrying findings. We found that when we asked about testing, only 1/3 of seed collectors and half of seed production growers provided test information on seed they sold. And almost half of seed purchasers expected testing, but they wouldn't, but 13% they wouldn't pay extra for this, and 25% they didn't even require it. We also asked each of the groups if it was common for the other groups to require testing or to supply it. And 80% of seed collectors, 72% of growers, and 75% of seed purchasers indicated it was uncommon to be asked for or offered seed test information. So again, these findings confirm that seed quality testing is not routine practice in the Australian native seed sector, and voluntary codes of practice aren't being adhered to, and that seed is routinely used in restoration without knowledge of its viability, with all the subsequent consequences. We had a lot of feedback about public funding and volunteers, and many people commented, and these were mainly commercial operators, that the use of volunteer labour disadvantaged private businesses by masking the true cost of procuring seeds or growing plants. So these were NGO groups and government groups that relied heavily on volunteer groups. And they questioned whether, as I said, NGOs and landcare groups then were able to additionally benefit from having access to volunteers when commercial operators, who are the biggest bulk of the sector, aren't able to access that resource. So that's a big issue for a lot of people. So in summary, this survey provided a broad overview of the structural characteristics of the native seed sector, and it shed light on a workforce that is small in terms of size, it has limited capacity, there is poor levels of training, and one where commercial operators play a much bigger role than what might have been in past decades. We found that there were a range of issues perceived to constrain the sector, and among them, future demand will be difficult to meet. The market is unwilling to pay for the true cost of seed. There is a lack of seed available from a broad range of species. Demand is inconsistent, it's unpredictable, and all this together can and does limit our access to this key resource for landscape scale restoration. So overall, the findings of our capacity survey indicate that the Australian seed market does not support large enterprises or the associated infrastructure and capacity required to undertake large-scale restoration, which we know we must do. And this presents a clear concern to all users of native seed. If you want to read the detail of this survey, and I would please urge you to do this, because we really need to understand the nuances of just how badly we are positioned to move forward, to do something serious about it in the way that Peggy and the people in the US have. We have just published, or about to publish, 2 papers in Restoration Ecology, which is a joint special edition coming out on the UN Decade for Restoration. We have 2 linked papers, as you can see, they're titled the Australian Seed Sector Characteristics and Perceptions, and the Australian seed sector behaviour and practice, and how they limit our capacity for upscale ecological restoration. My co-authors on those papers, and all to do with the seed survey, were Nola Hancock, Linda Broadhurst and Martin Driver, and we undertook that survey through the Australasian Network for Plant Conservation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. I believe we've got time for one quick question, if anyone has anything pressing.
G'day, Paul. Steve Field.
G'day, Steve.
Can you see a point in that whole cycle between, you know, collection and an end use where you could inject some market forces, or inject some stimulation to get this old bus running?
Thanks, mate. Yes, look, I do. And I think, again, we have to look to our American friends for guidance on this. And sadly, we don't seem to be doing it. Certainly politicians and regulators seem to be continuing to ignore the fact. But essentially what the Americans done, and I think in a brilliant way, has identified these areas where we most need to undertake restoration. Now, obviously over there, it's split between the Bureau of Land Management lands, which respond to you know, bushfires and climatic events, but also then on these large tracts of arable land in their Midwest and other parts of the country. And so on those lands where there is a huge need for restoration, they've created incentive programs that offer support for the owners of those lands, and they can be farmers, they could be land managers, they could be traditional owner groups or road and rail managers. They've created incentives for them, economic incentives, to put restoration, to put native vegetation back onto their landscapes. And that has created a need for seed and restoration services, which has created this huge industry and provided the seed and resources to do the restoration. In Australia, we do nothing like that, Steve. So our farmers aren't offered any incentive to restore native vegetation to their land. And here I'm talking about arable landscapes. So farmers, if they were offered an incentive to do it, because they've got to make a return on those landscapes, they need to survive, then that would create a market for seed from people like you. And you would then be able to generate seed. People who offer restoration services would be employed to restore land on those private lands. And in such a way, we would be getting restoration on the lands where it's most needed, and we would be generating the seed resources for seed production and whatnot to do that. So that is the great missing link in the Australian scenario. We don't identify the areas where we need seed most and create the incentives for people who live and own that land, live on and own that land, to actually undertake it.
Thank you, Paul. I will pass.